partnership between African states and the United States has run sour, especially since Donald Trump took office in Washington. We've seen the removal of U.S. aid, the promise and then the retraction, and then the promise and then the retraction of tariffs, and all sorts of things, statements directed against South Africa which are untrue. We don't know about other African states, but it's essentially pretty much of a mess. Online, Dr. Paul Kariuki, for this part of the show called African Mirror, Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program at University of KZN and convener at the Africa Policy Circle. Dr. Paul Kariuki, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shafiq, for having me on the show, and good afternoon to the listeners.
When we have a look at Africa and the scenario, US aid, I think, is the best example, that it's pretty much in chaos, relationships between Africa and the US. I don't know whether they managed to appoint chief of the Africa desk even. So we really are up in the air at the moment, aren't we?
We are on the air, and it's just a bit of a challenging situation at the moment because of the aggressive policy that His Excellency Donald Trump has approached, not only to Africa, but pretty much to the rest of the world, trying as much as possible to entrench the American dream on everyone, despite what people think about it. And it doesn't seem that's going to be any smoother anytime soon.
Now, when we look at things like US aid being taken away, I like to see the glass half full on this, although there's a lot of pain and even suffering that's going to go in between. That, in a sense, isn't it a lesson to us that in Africa we really need to understand that we have to become self-sufficient. We are going to have to learn basically to do things ourselves.
Exactly. And I think partly, as much as we are dismayed by that kind of aggressive policy stance, the reality, as you pointed out, is that we've had enough time to get our act together as a continent and most other developing countries to ensure that we can be able to lead our own development, manage our own resources properly, and of course eliminate every form of corruption and misadministration that has really mismanaged some of these resources that we received from countries like America. To some extent, one of his arguments was that for all the decades that they have been investing, that is, as America has been investing in different continents, including Africa, through their developmental aid, much of that money has found ways in people's pockets and other things that are not meant for the intention that they were given for. So to that point, he is right by saying maybe we need to pause this thing first and allow countries to rethink how they're going to work together with us. But on the other hand, he's also talking about it's time for America also to receive return on the investment. And so being a business person that he is, he's also looking at from a point of America has been helping the whole world with all their problems, but now there is nothing for Americans. And so it's a balancing act, and he's kind of laid out his priorities out front there. In an indirectly way, he's inviting countries to negotiate with him for anything new that they want to do together as partners. And I think we have to see it as a holistic process rather than just piecemeal based on the suffering that may come in the short to the medium term because of reduction or removal of funding.
Now, what I think is interesting out of this is, do you think that with America no longer giving Africa any kind of aid, that as African countries we will now be able to negotiate with other countries a lot more freely? We will not have one particular big boy in the hood telling us what to do or giving us loans or aid or whatever under their conditions. I mean, for example, the Chinese have a very different way of operating, as do some of the other countries.
It is true. It's time for African leadership and other developing countries to rethink about how they integrate themselves with America. Look, the bottom line is there is no way that the continent can do away with the youth. And the U.S. also, there's no way they can stay outside of working with the continent, the African continent, simply because there are so many intersecting interests that both the America and Africa as a continent have in common. And so the opportunity now that we have as a continent is to do the following. A, is to renegotiate our partnerships and diversifying them as much as possible. The reliance of one big boy has come to an end. Now we need to renegotiate how we enter into this partnership. Secondly, talk with one united voice, so that we can be able as a continent to put our interests at the forefront and resist any temptation to be isolated just because of lack of resources. And thirdly, we must be sincere to ourselves. It is time to promote good, or should I say better and sustainable governance. We've had problems in managing resources for a very long time. If you just look at the figures of how much money is lost on this continent due to corruption, any investor outside of Africa has the right to say, enough, we cannot give these people any more money. But still, there are windows of negotiation, there are windows of compassion somewhere, and there is still willingness to engage. But that window is closing up very fast. If we do not enforce better governance on our continent, we're going to be in a very, very difficult position in the years to come. And lastly, it's important that also we promote better regional integration. We have this facility called ACFTA, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's still a problem that some of our African countries have not ratified, and that is pushing that agreement, to move in a very slow pace, because we cannot afford to dilly-dally when the rest of the world is reorganizing itself on how it wants to engage with the rest. And so Africa must work faster, must work smart, and must take care of the small foxes that really keep on hurting our ability to put our collective voice and be taken seriously at the global platforms.
Then there's another question that arises, and I speak open to correction here. I do believe that before Trump came into office, around Africa there were 22 AFRICOM sites, I'll call it that, where there were a handful of U.S. forces, or U.S. forces were there for so-called strategic regions. We know that AFRICOM is in Somalia. I know in Kenya, for example. I don't know too much about the other countries. Have you heard of any indications of the United States leaving Africa militarily? Because I've heard nothing on this front.
Actually, it's not in the radar of President Trump. At the moment, he's not interested in security matters on the continent except DRC Congo. And that DRC Congo has just come lately because he is interested there primarily for minerals, not for their security, but for them to be able to do proper mining there, they have to have some insecurity around where their economic interests are about. So I think he's yet to pronounce any interest on maintaining military sports on the continent, but I've also seen some media reports of interest in Burkina Faso. And it is yet to be spelled out, from a policy point of view or pronounced from that point of view. But there is a little bit of flurry of activity between the U.S., one of the generals there, interested in matters going on in Burkina Faso. But I think his interest at the moment is to consolidate America's global economic strategy and force the notion of making America great again as part of his campaign discussion. And at this point in time, he has just put his foot on the accelerator. In other words, it's either you are any country alliance with them or you're out of business. And you can see this with the tariff position that he has taken across the globe. There is no country that has been spared. You've got now countries being forced to collaborate with America as far as trade is concerned based on his terms and inviting you to negotiate. I think military is not of our interest at the moment, a priority for him at the moment.
Yeah, and when we look at the situation, do you think that the United States will simply swat Africa away? I mean, Africa is not even, as you say, on Trump's radar very much, except for South African whites, who seem to be enjoying some very strange and weird and wonderful, not wonderful, but weird privileges. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole.
Exactly. But now we know for the South African context, we know that he's got an influencer who is really, fronting the interests of one of our minority groups here. But on the whole, he cannot afford to do away with Africa as a continent as such. He can do away with countries where he has no particular economic interest. but he cannot do away with some, because there is still a lot of intertwining that is needed, and he needs African voices in some of the global multilateral engagements. For example, with the G20 that South Africa is privileged to host this year. And of course, for matters of United Nations Security Council, he still needs the continent. The issue is now, for him, the most important thing is that he's promoting the American agenda through his action. It's for the African continent to think about how does she position herself in a more advantageous way that will make sure that despite the tough policy stance that he has presented, Africa still wins. That's our biggest challenge, Shafiq, because up to this moment, the continent is still suffering from diverged and united positions on many things, and we rarely present a common position as a continent, which is to our detriment.
And of course, presenting a united voice, I mean, Muammar Gaddafi had the dream of the United States of Africa, and there I would tend to agree with him. That would be amazing, wouldn't it, if Africa spoke as one? Trump would probably sit up in the middle of the night and realize that this is not Mickey Mouse that he's playing with here.
That's the position, and you can look at what, for example, our counterparts on the other continent, European Union, how they're galvanizing their positions on every matter of interest to make sure that they are not swallowed up with this geopolitical rivalry that the American global strategy is presenting. The continent of Asia, led by China, they're consolidating their positions continuously through their Asian forum and trying to put themselves in a position where they can trade with the U.S. and other countries from an advantage point of view. The only continent that is still yet to catch up or wake up is our continent. And this is really sad because we have so much to offer. We are very much blessed as a continent with minerals, with arable land, with youthful population, with committed population that is interested in developing herself. But can the continent turn this geopolitical rivalry into a genuine opportunity for her sovereign development? That is a big question that can only be answered by the leadership of the African Union, which is tasked with the responsibility of galvanizing support from the member states. And then secondly, can the member states put down their narrow country visions and embrace a continental vision that puts our voice in the right spaces policy-making wise? These are bigger questions that demand a lot of questions and answers and contemplation. And I'm glad that now we have a new chair at the African Union who seems to be very in touch with the global geopolitics. I think he's going to do a great job, but it also depends very much on the support that the member countries are going to give him. If there's not going to be support from the member states, then you can bet for me we are going to go down the drain because we do not have much time as a continent to get our act together.
Indeed, that's the message for this week's African Mirror. If we're in Africa, we must get our act together, given current world global political circumstances. African Mirror, as always, our special guest, Dr. Paul Kariuki, Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program at the University of KZN and convener at the Africa Policy Circle. Dr. Kariuki, as always, a great pleasure.